I'm here today with still Tish, and today she's going to talk to us about a little bit about her story. But first of all, would you go ahead and tell us why it is that you need to be anonymous?
Well, I should just say that from my point of view, as someone who also campaigns for women's rights, I do use my real name on any petitions, any conversations. I have spoken publicly, but I was specifically asked to keep my real name private because I have a trans identifying son. Now, I did speak at a talk, and after that meeting, it was loaded on Miranda Yardley. I don't know if you know Miranda Yardley, a trans identified male who, and so I was speaking alongside Miranda, and Miranda put it on their YouTube with my real name, and I didn't think anything of it. But sure enough, very soon it was found out, it was linked. They were trying to get access to my son. Now, I'm a feminist of the old fashioned persuasion, so I haven't changed my name, and my children have a mix of their dads. So they don't use it very often, but for safety, I really needed just to keep that, because trans activists would love to get hold of a son whose mum is known for not being on board with gender ideology.
That's a really good point. Typically, people want to be anonymous because they're worried about their own personal safety or repercussions at work or repercussions with friends and family. But in your case, you're worried that it could really be used to exploit your son's situation.
Yeah, I mean, I have spoken publicly and I've run the gauntlet of warriors on the opposite side of the debate. So I'm probably known, and that my identity will be known, and possibly my address will be known because some of the activists live in my constituency. But so long as they can't connect that to my son, all is good.
Yeah, and do you mind telling us about your son and how he sort of how you think he got pulled into this ideology?
I can give you some ideas about how it happened. I should just say that he, as a young boy, there were early signs that he quite possibly might turn out to be gay. Um, I don't know how to explain that other than by using things that might look a bit like cliches, but there were just little things about his mannerisms, behaviour, his interests. And I'll give you a funny story, which is a bit cliche, but the boys where we live, there's like a back space where young lads used to all play together. They were all boys in his immediate age range who lived there. And they would argue because some of them wanted to play cricket and some of them wanted to play football. My son would go out and mediate and say, let's do neither, let's put on a show. So he had that sort of bit of flamboyance, not femininity, I have to say. I would describe it as a variant way of expressing his masculinity. So we were very careful as liberal parents. We would say things like, when you grow up, when you get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, so we'd do all of those things. So he knew that we were comfortable and fine with however he ended up identifying without pushing it on him at a young age, because some boys who are like that actually turn out to be straight, but
Right.
just with a theatrical flair.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because my older son, I had so many people tell me, "Oh, he's gay." Just so this was when he was quite young, 3, 4, 5 years old, and because he sort of adhered to these. He liked musicals, and he was very flamboyant, like you said. He would, other kids would be playing on the field, playing some sport, and he would be, maybe picking flowers. Very sensitive, tender kid. And now he's grown up and he's had a girlfriend now for 4 or 5 years, and they're very close. And so I think sometimes parents get these ideas about these, stereotypes of what a child is going to grow up to be. And it is interesting that those stereotypes are so sort of firmly embedded in our society that people who didn't know me very well or know my children very well would, whisper in my ear, he's gay, when he was just, like 4 or 5 years
Yeah.
old. And it makes me sad that parents already are concerned about their children's sexuality at that age. But I think it's because we live in a society where, girls who are not feminine and boys who are not masculine are kind of already pigeonholed from the time they're quite little, into having.
And it's definitely got worse, because
Mhm.
I grew up in the north of England, one of 8 children, 2 boys and 6 girls.
Wow.
And we girls we weren't even called tomboys. We were just the norm
Mhm.
for working class girls in that neighborhood, climbing trees, jumping off buildings, building dens, building barricades, and having stone fights with neighboring boys. I mean, and it was just that nobody ever considered that we were anything other than girls. I mean, my mum used to try and wrestle us into party frocks, but generally speaking, that was for special occasions. The rest of the time, we were in. I mean, I was often in hand-me-down clothes from my brothers, and we called them our playing out clothes because they were practical, and girls wore them as even my uber feminine, glamorous New York sister would have been in those clothes in that day, back in the day.
Well, and if you were anything, I don't know what your clothes were like, but if they were anything like ours, the boys' clothes had pockets and the girls' clothes didn't. And so that was still one of the issues that I have with women's clothes. Oftentimes they'll even have fake pockets. And I'm like, they give us fake pockets, but they don't give us real pockets, because I guess we're not supposed to carry frogs in our pockets, or, stick an apple in our pocket for snack later or something. And so that's one of the things that's always bothered me about the difference between boys and girls clothes, is just their affordances. Boys clothes are just more practical. They are more for kids who are going to go out and play.
Yeah, and I think we've become a lot more rigid in enforcing those stereotypes through my observations.
Yeah. So your son, when he was little, had some kind of quirks of personality. As he was a young teenager, I don't know at what age he developed his.
Well, he came out to me and told me he was gay at I think 11.
Okay.
And I said, yeah, it's not a surprise. He went back upstairs. He had a friend over. They were doing something upstairs. Nothing more was said until he was 14. And then he said, I think I'm trans.
Oh, so he was young.
Yeah.
14 is young.
Yeah. But it's not unusual if you think that even though we were quite accepting of the fact that he might potentially be gay, he got relentless homophobic bullying. So
Wow.
if you're getting the stirrings of attraction to the sex that are your bullies, so he gravitated towards female friends. But if you think about what happens when you hit puberty, girl friendships can be difficult for girls to navigate. But I think the boys, they don't have the same route map. So there would be the typical fallings out that happen in girl relationships. And he wasn't always good at navigating them, is my perception. Because he did say to me, I sometimes ended up on the wrong side of everybody. Because either he tried to mediate or he took a side, and then the girls mended their friendship and he was the one who'd taken a side. And I think, so he ended up, all his friends were girls, but at teenage, those relationships became more difficult to navigate. The girls started having sleepovers quite reasonably. He wasn't included. He was included at one. I would never have insisted on that. You're a parent of girls, your responsibility to protect your girls. He was included in one, which I must admit, the parents knew him. They were comfortable having him there. I was delighted that he wasn't left out, but I would never have pushed for it. And those lovely little girls sent him home with manually pierced ears, which was not an act of cruelty, I should say. It just made me laugh that he had a barbarous thing done to him while he was on a lovely, cuddly girls' night. So I was pleased that he was included. I think parents have the right to include him. All of which to say is that it became a little bit lonelier, I think.
So how old is he now? Do you mind me asking?
He's 21 now.
Okay, so he's had this identity for a very long time.
It depends how you say he's had this identity, because when he brought it with me first, I didn't really know much about it until I started to look into the ideology. And then it just seemed it was based on sex stereotypes. And I wouldn't say I'm a radical feminist. I'm radical feminist adjacent. I'm not pure.
Really good way of putting it. I'm going to have to remember that.
Yeah. So that's how I would describe myself. I like a lot of the radical feminist take on this, but I diverge slightly on some issues whilst having a great deal of respect for many of the women who endorse that position. So I think I don't want to embarrass the movement. So I will say I'm radical feminist adjacent, so I can never let them down by failing a purity test. So he knows all of that, because I've got, my house is full of books. Many of them are feminist texts from Mary Astle in the 1600s, Wollstonecraft, obviously Germaine Greer, all of the new ones that I latterly discovered, Janice Raymond, Transsexual Empire, all of the ones. And then obviously, so our house is full of books that are all about women's history. And so when he came out to me, and we didn't discuss it really much, but I started to look into it and I thought, no, I'm not really comfortable with that. So when we did sort of discuss, I'd say, well, what makes you feel? I just feel it. I think at least one of the conversations I did say to him, I think the reason why you will explain what makes you feel like you're a woman is because you will have to do it in sexist stereotypes, and you know that I will call you out on that. So all he would say was, this is how I feel. I need to be my authentic self. All of the things that we're hearing that are standard parts of the narrative. So all of it sounded very coached and not very real at all.
Yeah. Which is amazing, because this was a while ago.
Well, you say it was a while ago, but if what I have done is I've had a look at what was going on in the media that he was exposed to. To put it in context, although it seems like it's been going on for years and it must be very early, actually all of the propaganda was already out there. So Childline was a significant one. And the reason why I know he was looking at Childline was because he was sharing YouTube videos of influencers that were female, identified as men, were all on testosterone, superficially passed very well. And in retrospect, I realised that he was sort of softening me up by showing me these influencers. So when
what
I
did you think when you saw them?
Well, I didn't know. One of them was a female who identified as a man who did comedy posts pretending to be their mum. So they were quite funny.
Right.
And they were cleverly done. So he just showed me them for comedic purposes. I thought nothing of them.
Okay.
But after a while, I started to track back that he wasn't showing me overt content, but those same people were producing lots of what I would call effectively grooming videos. But what I hadn't known and subsequently realised, that it was all being pushed on Childline, which is, it's a premier children's charity in the UK.
Yeah, so those of us in the US, I've never heard of it before.
Yeah, it's massive over here.
Wow.
Childline. So I did a 10-part series on their content, not just for this issue, but they also were terrible on porn. And they used a YouTube influencer to do it was called what the fuck, but WTF, the porn. And it's aimed at children. And it had search terms for extreme porn, hentai, which is banned in Australia because it mimics girl children in cartoon form and it's paedophilia adjacent. That has subsequently been taken down after my blog on it, which I did send to quite a few journalists. So I may very well have been connected to that being removed, but I've downloaded it and I kept it. And I did a 10-part series analysing most of their LGBTQ content, which virtually didn't mention lesbians, even when they were interviewing two lesbians. And I analysed all the statistics so you can see how many times gay, lesbian were used. And even when they had a gay male on, one of them seemed to feel obliged to mention that although he was a gay man, he did know a gay man who was now with a woman and still considered himself to be a gay man. So it was all the ideology was there.
Wow. Yeah. So we'll make sure to link to your blog in the description.
Yeah. So I did an analysis of that. I also have done quite a few on what I call marketing the transgender child. These are programs that were on the BBC. Now, if you think about when you're making the tea and you think your children are going to be safe, you leave them watching children's BBC, and you don't imagine that you've got to scrutinise anything on there. But in fact, the BBC were pushing a programme called Becoming Leo, or I Am Leo, and it's a story about a girl who thinks she's a boy. It pushes puberty blockers, everything. So that's the environment. Now, that is just the content that I could find that I knew he'd seen, not anything he personally sought out or had been directed to based on algorithms on YouTube. And, you know, this is where parents of my generation who, you know, when we got a computer in my school, it made local news, headline news, school gets computer, you know.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because when my school got their first computers, really it was sort of tacitly acknowledged that only the boys went into the computer room.
Well, I have a funny story about that, because I was actually in that broadcast and they asked me to come in to look like I was doing something on the computer. But again, but the girls never got in the computer room. It was just to make it look fair.
Wow.
And I never got in there again.
Yeah, I mean, if a girl walked into the computer room, she would be, I mean, a wall of boys would stop her from getting access to the computers. It was that, you know, I mean, it just wasn't a space where girls were allowed, even though technically they were.
Yeah, that's the same. You would not have felt welcome in there.
Yeah.
But I think the point of that anecdote really is that had I been a bit more savvy, I would have realised that I needed to police what he was seeing a lot more than I did. And we only had a computer in the middle room that was downstairs, and it's not like I was completely reckless. Yeah. But once you get into the realm of them using computers at school, needing computers for homework, you really, the genie's out of the bottle and very hard to know how to put it back in. Had I my time to come all over again, I probably would have been a tech Nazi.
Yeah. Well, and again, we were from the generation where computers were brand new and we weren't really allowed access to them. But I'm guessing our kids are close to the same age that, like you said, the schools assume that kids have unlimited access to computers at home. And so it's really hard to police that. And especially for those of us who didn't grow up super tech savvy.
Yeah, it's very difficult because they need one for their homework.
Yeah,
I mean, it has other issues about equity for children from poorer homes as well. And a lot of I think the style of learning has become like sheets rather than reading. Which I'm a big reader, so that was why I expected to see, but I didn't even see it in my son who's just finished his A-levels. This sort of book, although they both do like reading, but not to anything like the extent I felt they should have been for school.
And right, I mean, I don't see a lot of sort of the basic skills that were emphasized when we were growing up. It really does seem like a lot of, you know, there's research where kids are supposed to get on a computer and find the answers to, you know, Google a few questions and find the answers to them, rather than do actual research or do actual
and so it's not reputable sources that are, you know, because I can remember even at primary school saying, should we be not cautioning them even now at such a young age about Wikipedia as a source, because we know that's edited by a lot of activists. And it was nothing to do with this issue. It's just that I did history for my first degree, history and English, and I did history and literature for my second degree. And yeah, the sources is so important. It felt like such a fundamental skill. And again, that also ties into this debate, because those kids are searching what they think are reputable sources, and they don't have the skills to realise that research paper is produced by someone affiliated with, say, Boston Children's Hospital, who have got a vested financial interest, or someone like Jack Turban, who takes money from various organisations. So they see all those reputable, in inverted commas, sources and think, my mum doesn't know what he knows, he's an expert. And I think all ties into perhaps we're not teaching these sort of skills, critical thinking, checking sources, primary sources, double checking, which is so fundamental.
And also the idea that if you Google something and you find the answer, that's the truth.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think you're right that there's, you know, it's sort of they set up the environment such that it's very easy to see how kids could get sucked into this ideology. So the fact that your son, you know, identified as trans, did he start pushing to medicalize right away, or did he just want to be...
The first time I can remember him actually pushing to medicalise was possibly when he was 16.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very painful conversation, because I said, I can't, because to me, it's going to harm you. I've done the research and it is going to harm you. And you can't expect me to do something that I think will medically harm you. Now, he's quite responsive, because he knows, even now, he knows that I love him. I know that. He knows that his parents love him, even though we fundamentally disagree on this. So I'm trying to remember, I don't think he ever played the literal suicide card, but he certainly did get quite emotive. My life can't start, blah, blah. I was trying to explain that, you know, you've not even had your first kiss. You've not, you know, I don't want to do anything like that until I'm in the right body. I want to be my authentic self. Again, it was sort of like a script. So that ended up with me saying no, him not being able to do it independently. We had a big hug, and then we watched a film together.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great that at least he wasn't super emotionally manipulative. But still, it's got to be hard watching your son go down a path and when you know it's not the right path, and not be able to stop him.
No, I mean, I genuinely thought by the time he'd got to 19 that we'd maybe navigated him out of it. We encouraged him. He really loves his music, and he goes to gigs all over, and we let him go to different countries even at like 15, which is part, but not helicopter parents anyway, because I went all over. I went down to London to stay with my sister in a big boarding school she worked at when I was 13 on my own. We went miles when we were like 9 and 10. I mean, and I wanted to at least have some of that freedom for our children. So I would sometimes have my heart in my mouth, but I would let them sort of roam further, because I was well aware that their kind of landscape of where they played had shrunk from what the kind of landscape we explored as children. And I wasn't from a rural, I was from a town with some sort of fields. So it was not like a sort of purely idyllic rural environment, but we went everywhere. So I tried to do that. So I'm not a helicopter parent, and we did try and encourage him to go for his gigs. So he'd go to London, get back at 4 o'clock in the morning. We weren't even strict about that being on a school night, as long as he went to school and tried to sleep on the bus, because I felt like that would give him like a circle. I love people like Kylie Minogue. I took him to a signing by Kylie Minogue is a gay icon in the UK, as many of these female singers that he likes are. And I thought, he's going to see other gay boys there, and it's going to make him realise that he's not on his own. That other boys have the same interests as him, like doing the same things as him. And I genuinely hope that would bring him out the other side. Now, whether the lockdown, COVID-19, sucked him back into a virtual world, by this age, he's got his own computer. I don't have access to it. You know, in my darker moments, I wish I'd have put spyware on there, but I also morally don't agree with that either. So, rock and a hard place. And then when he was 19, just before Christmas, I needed the vacuum cleaner, because as usual, I'd left all domestic chores to the last possible minute until it needed to be done. And he had the vacuum in his room, because my boys both do their own room, their own not washing. They're very good on that sort of thing. And when I went in there, I found all the drugs. And I don't often cry. I'm quite a tough cookie. I was just incoherent. And I did actually ring my friend, but I couldn't get my words out. I rang a friend of mine who's a a woman I've met through all of this, a lesbian who lives near me, and who's been a great support to me, and I couldn't get my words out. And then I took pictures of all the documentation so I'd have an audit trail of the timings. He'd been referred, well, I won't give the exact dates, but suffice to say, they had done some blood tests. So there had been a second appointment where he got the referral. My own GP did this.
Oh, wow. And you
And
didn't,
referred him. Well, legally, I'm not allowed to know.
Yeah, and that's, yep.
But I do know because I've got copies of and I'll go on to how I interact with my GP practice over this. So he was referred to the adult branch of the Tavistock in my city. Tavistock, as you will know, has just had its children and adolescent mental health for this gender dysphoria closed down. And his drugs had arrived just the week before Christmas. So all in all, from referral to drugs, it was about 6 weeks. And I'm very clear on that time because I took the delivery of the drugs, but I didn't know what they were. He just told me it was some skin creams.
Wow.
So I don't know.
That is even happening faster now in the US. I'm not sure if you're aware of Planned Parenthood, but they have an informed consent model where someone can go in and get the prescription the day of their appointment. So,
well, what I should be clear about is I don't know who is prescribing him.
Yeah.
I have looked at the YouTube on the Tavistock, and they kind of imply that, they very explicitly state that they will try and get them quite fast tracked. So I've got that, I've downloaded that.
Wow.
So it could be them, but also the chemist that supplies them, who I know from the documentation, well, the actual drugs themselves, is the same one that's used by an outfit called Gender GP. Oh, wow. Gender GP is run by two doctors called Helen and Mike Webberley. Mike Webberley's been struck off now.
Yeah.
Helen Webberley has been suspended for a couple of years and she's now on an extended suspension.
Wow.
So I can say it is the same chemist, but it could possibly be the same chemist that is used by the Tavistock.
Wow.
So I can't pin who actually prescribed him. I don't think it was my GP, but I did immediately write to them, and I was furious because I knew that the Tavistock wasn't evidence-based. On my website, I've done a very long series on the Tavistock. I look at research papers, I've covered whistleblowers, I've covered YouTubes by the man who set up the Tavistock. I've done a lot of work to so I know what the practices are there. It's ideologically predicated, it's not evidence-based, and they're not safe. So I send all that. In fact, I probably contact my GP nearly every week. And because I'm also their patient, I made it clear that this is the only way that keeps me sane. And if they're worried about suicidal ideation in our children, they should be worried about suicide ideation in parents. And sending them that information, he will know that I never let him down. I fought for him every day, every week, with research, more research than my GP will have done, I'm sure. So they don't reply to me anymore. I mean, obviously, medical ethics, I completely respect the fact that they cannot share any of my son's medical details, but I do send them things. And if I send something, I say, you do know that brain maturation goes up to 25. We don't know what cognitive function development takes place. You have now blocked that pubertal development. Are you doing any brain scans? Blah, blah, blah. So I send them something every week because whatever happens, if there's legal cases,
right, you need to document.
He will know that I never stopped fighting.
Wow.
And the other thing that I do is he asked me not to bring it up with him because he said that's the only way we'll preserve our relationship. And I agreed on the condition that I said, I will always send you medical information. I will also send you gay male detransitioners. And so I said, ideally, if you have an email address, I'll email research to you. You can then just put it in a box, look at it when you're ready. But he wouldn't let me do that. So I just text him or WhatsApp YouTubes. And I don't do it relentlessly. I do it periodically, just so that he's getting that other side of it and that he can look at it in his own time. And it's funny because he never mentions it, because I do it when he's out of the house, so he doesn't have to be in the house dealing with me sending him things. And then he'll come home and he'll say, shall we watch a Grey's Anatomy?
And he doesn't.
And we don't mention it, but
Right.
I'm doing my bit by keeping that line of communication open, and that's all I can do, really.
Yeah. And you mentioned puberty blockers. So is he on a puberty blocker as well as a cross-sex hormone?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he's 21.
21, so he's now been on them for a year and 6 months, is it?
See, and that's one of the things that I think most people don't realize. They have this idea that gender clinics put children on puberty blockers until they start cross-sex hormones. But over and over again, I'm hearing of adults being put on puberty blockers, and that as soon as they're put on puberty blockers, their genitals start to atrophy. And so the information that we're getting is very disingenuous from the gender clinics.
Oh, I know. It's it's ideologically predicated, and it's built on, obviously it's a religion.
Yeah.
It's a belief. Over and over again, when I look at research on this, I think the only way you could do this is if you are so convinced that gender identity is innate, immutable, fixed. And yet even that's inconsistent, because in the same breath they'll talk about gender fluidity.
Right. Well, and they have no sense of this being a mystical belief. I mean, if you're born in the wrong body, there has to be either a medical or a spiritual reason for that. So either there's a God who accidentally makes a mistake and puts you in the wrong body, and you're, so you have a gendered soul, or there would be some very clear medical evidence to suggest that somehow somebody's brain could be born in the wrong body. But again, like we talked about earlier, it's all based on regressive sex-based stereotypes. And so
even the research that's quoted is either doesn't control for homosexuality and doesn't even control for men who are on cross-sex hormones, or neuroplasticity, where perhaps performing a certain role might have, because obviously you're basing it on stereotypes, aren't you? You're reading what you think should be the thing that you do as a woman. If you're consciously performing, inverted commas, womanly behaviors, I don't doubt that you could end up with a neuroplasticity giving you more.
Yeah, and Patrick Lappert talks about this. He talks about the fact that, our brains are very malleable, and depending on the behaviors we take on, it is going to change our brain functions. And it's not surprising. He used the example of drinking alcohol, that he grew up not drinking alcohol at all. And then when he joined the military, sort of everybody encouraged him to drink alcohol. And now he's, a whiskey connoisseur. And I might have that story not exactly right, but that was sort of the gist of it. But, so we can cultivate behaviors even, if we decide, boy, in order to fit in better, I think I'm going to learn to play golf. And that's going to change our brain scans. It's going to change our function. The behaviors that we engage in impact so it's sort of the chicken egg thing, of course, if
and it's in a way to gain acceptance, you adopt behaviors that you think are the behaviors that women do, but actually a lot of them are based on regressive stereotypes that we women have long ago sort of abandoned, or at least challenged, or don't 100% fit or feel comfortable doing any of those things, while some women might. Lots of us don't.
Well, and to me it's really disconcerting, because it's giving a message to younger girls that being a woman is based on these regressive sex-based stereotypes that we worked so hard to get rid of. And it just makes me really angry that we have men who are dressed up as sort of caricatures of women, wearing woman face, if you will.
I agree.
And that these are the messages our young women and girls are getting, that this is what it means to be a woman. How offensive.
Well, I have to say, obviously, I hope it's clear, I absolutely adore my son completely.
Yeah.
But I don't give him a pass for that either. because he is older. And I have said to him, I know that for you, this feels like a solution for you, but you don't get a pass for ignoring what's happening for rapists in women's prisons, men in women's sports. All of these things are impacting on the sex you claim to identify with. And I know he finds that really uncomfortable, but it has to be said, I've got a moral duty. I'm not just there as his friend. I'm his mum, I'm his guardian. I have got a right to say these things. And again, he's quite good at accepting differences of opinion,
Well, and I can see now as you're talking why you are so protective of him, because it sounds like he hasn't been completely taken
Well,
over by the
he
ideology.
still doesn't use female spaces. That
Oh, okay.
is really important to me.
Good for
that
him.
He doesn't.
Yeah, good for him.
And I don't doubt that the world is uncomfortable for him to navigate, because his background was being a bullied gay male. I can have a lot of empathy for that, but the solution is an individual solution. And when you're so convinced that's a solution for you, you have got a duty to look at the impact on others. And I do know some trans-identified males, even though I don't agree with the ideology at all, who do respect women's spaces and don't use them. And I would rather that my son didn't progress down a medical route. I think it's harmful. It's going to I think it will shave years off his life expectancy. He's got a genetic predisposition for multiple sclerosis, which comes from my side of the family, and cross-sex hormones for men who take hormones that are predominantly associated with females, but they're synthetic cross-sex hormones, obviously. They have a 5 times increase in multiple sclerosis. And the worst thing about that is women are 68% more likely to get multiple sclerosis, but we're more likely to get relapsing remitting and not the most severe forms. Men who get multiple sclerosis are lower in number, but they have a significantly worse rate of progression. So I don't know if boys who take the cross-sex hormones end up getting a female pattern or a male pattern. So he could actually be exacerbating it to a much worse degree for all these drugs. And of course, I sent that to my GP because they know he's got a family history of multiple sclerosis. What do you do when the medical profession has completely abandoned all its ethics?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, all the different ways that we're experimenting with this on vulnerable people who need mental health services and need support and need kindness and caring, but not this ideology, which, like you said, it's gonna, it's damaging his body. Have you seen any changes in how he looks since he started taking?
Well, this is the thing. He's always been, at times, he's sort of battled with his weight. I think comfort eating from the loneliness of bullying, I understand all of that. Actually, he did a very good job of losing all the weight, which now I look back, he probably was doing it knowing that he would have to lose weight so he could be medicalised. But no, he doesn't. I mean, he just wears jeans and T-shirts, big baggy tops. I've got no doubt there must be the beginnings of gynecomastia now, but you wouldn't know it. He has long hair, don't wear makeup, don't use women's spaces. Wherever this identity is being performed, it is not in real life. But again, that's not unusual in some boys. It's almost as if they have to, well, girls, obviously, testosterone packs a punch. Their changes come in very quickly that are visible. For boys, inevitably, the only way they're going to, in any way, inverted commas, pass, even though they won't, mostly, you're looking at surgeries, aren't you? And I think there is that thing of, oh, well, when I'm my true self, then I will be able to go out. And a lot of boys seem to do the medicalising bit first without whereas in the old days, you would have been forced to live in role. Even though that itself is problematic, it would mean you would get, what's the word, for like a check on your fantasy. By you would see how the real world reacts to you. He hadn't done any of that.
Well, and
so it's all very strange.
I really wonder with these kids, as you're talking, one of the things that puberty blockers do is they reduce or eliminate libido. And I wonder how many of these kids who are uncomfortable with their sexuality get on these puberty blockers, and it makes them feel more comfortable because they don't have this
Yeah,
conflict anymore. Their libido goes away, so they can just sort of
yeah, I
carry on
think
with
that's
life
part
without
of it
that
too
conflict.
as well.
Yeah. Which
You
is
know,
really sad because as difficult as the struggling with that can be, it's such an important part of adult life.
well, I did a long podcast with a gay male who does one called Human Gay Male, and we talked about that because I was talking about the representations of adult gay male sexuality. Well, you know, I'm against porn that involves females. Gay male porn, not my bailiwick. It is a different issue. I'm not going to pass an opinion on it, but the representations that I see in the media that my son sees, although, you know, they might be kind of celebratory, rampant sexuality and all lovely and joyous and an expression of something that's been repressed for years, and I can completely understand that. My son was brought up watching, if he was ever, I feel we would watch an old film together. His poorly video was George Cukor's The Woman from 1930s, and then we would watch the modern one and compare and contrast the two films and talk about. So I've got a house full of old black and white films, and that's what we used to watch. And I wondered whether that kind of sort of purveying of old fashioned sort of romances, where is that for a gay boy? Where did he get the equivalent? There's only one gay film that he told me he'd watched, and it's set in Yorkshire, which is where we are, and it's called, I think it's called God's Own Country, and it's a love story between two gay men on a farm, and one of them is used to doing sort of casual, sort of furtive sex, and carries on doing it when he's met the love of his life. And the love of his life is not into that because he wants a lover who's faithful, and ends up going back to his home country. And it ends up with this romantic story of the man realizing that he wants the only man and doesn't need all of this other sex, and goes to find him back in his home country. That's the only film that my son, and it's very instructive to me that that's a romantic story, because I think it must be quite scary, the kind of
Yeah, and from
might
what
do
I've
that to
seen
your
of gay
sort
male
of
porn, it's
sexuality.
yeah, the gay male porn that I have seen is pretty degrading. It's and this is from way back when I was in college. There was a fair amount of gay male porn that was circulating in the dorms, and even back then, it was very demeaning. It was very objectifying of especially
You
of
see,
the
I haven't done any research into that,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
I did kind of wonder
Yeah,
whether it
it's
was more.
probably for your sanity better
Yeah,
that you haven't
I'm
because there are,
probably not going to do it, but I did wonder whether it might be more, well, naively, perhaps it'd be more equal and not quite so power based and violent and
no, I
degrading.
remember the first gay male porn I saw, and this was in the dorms when I was in college, so this was quite a while ago. And basically it was a guy who was hiding under a bed, and somebody would come in and lay on the bed, and he would essentially take them forcefully. And so it was looked to me like a rape fantasy kind of.
Oh,
And
okay.
that was it was very low budget. But since then I've seen a lot of it's not in any, I mean, it's very much like the female porn. There's usually someone who's in charge and who's going to take someone by making them submit. It it's
There's something
very
deeply wrong in a culture that can't posit any relationship without inverting, having a hierarchy,
mhm,
whether you invert that or whether you know, that whole, because obviously BDSM is a huge underpinning to
mhm,
transgender ideology. I
yeah.
mean, there's just loads of it everywhere. And again, it's meant to be liberating, that if you make the man submissive and the woman dominant, somehow you're disrupting the binary, whatever but you're not. You're just
No,
doing the same thing. Because,
yeah, it's just demeaning and
great sex doesn't involve someone pulling your hair, choking
right,
you, or spitting
spitting
on
on
you.
you or yeah,
Doesn't.
doing these horrible things. And that's one of the things that I was thinking a lot about it because someone on Facebook recently posted about BDSM and issues regarding sexuality and homosexuality. And one of the things that I would love to see someone research, which I haven't seen anybody research, but how many of the, before this sort of whole thing came about, how many of those who had a trans identity as a youngster grew up and got involved in porn? Because almost every adult who's, my age or around my age who talks about having had a trans identity somehow got sucked into porn as well, either by watching it or making it. And I do wonder, if the porn is a symptom of the larger damage to our psyche, that rather than the cause of it. I know that there are a lot of people who talk about porn causing these transgender identities, but I wonder if we're gravitated to it because of there's already a damage to our sexuality, to our psyche.
Possibly. I mean, I read a little bit about sissy porn, and I did read a thesis by a trans-identified male about how BDSM had cemented his identity as a woman, and how offensive is this? His identity as a woman was as a victim. So when he entered into some encounter, I think they ended up, their safe words got ignored, and they ended up feeling abused, humiliated.
Wow.
And what did he take from that? I felt validated as a woman.
Wow.
And this is very common. Andrea Chu,
yes,
great. I've got quotes on many of my blogs with many of them saying, basically that's what they think women are, to be abused and victimized. And it's just, and it's so prevalent, especially in prominent, like Andrea Chu was very honest about it. I think Grace Lavery might have said something similar. There are quite a few anyway.
And you see it on social media. You see these men who say, somebody essentially sexually harassed them, and now they finally feel like a woman. It's very offensive. It's very disgusting. And it's easy to feel just horrified at that particular man. But you got to wonder what's going on in our society, that there are men who want to be women and they finally feel validated when they've been abused. There's something really very disturbing about that.
I mean, I must admit, even though it has come into the heart of my home, and it has totally, I gave up work because I was working in the university sector, and I knew between my turfism and my trade union activity, I was never going to get a job back there. And I took the financial hit and had no income for 5 years and just worked on this full time. You'll see on my blog that there's now, I think, about 208 pieces on this topic, and I do work on it full time, because all I can think is, if I can't change society to stop this happening, I can't stop it alone. And there are other boys and girls and children that are being experimented on. And so I've kind of made it my crusade, for want of a better word.
I know the feeling. Yeah, I feel like I've done the same. There's no way I'll ever get a job in academia again. This is a difficult question to ask, but do you suspect that your son was ever sexually assaulted or abused?
The thing is, he lives at home. You don't know, do you? I don't think so. I don't think so, but then I wouldn't, would I? Because nobody wants to think that about their child. He doesn't, I don't get the sense. Obviously my sons have both had the Gail Dines conversation about porn. I suspect they can't escape it, but they know very much what my feelings are about it and its negative effects on male sexuality. And I have mentioned erectile dysfunction. But what my son will say to me is asexual. And I don't get the sense that he'd be, but I could be wrong. And I don't get the sense that anything happened. But I haven't outright asked him. And you never know, do you? Even though.
Well, and unfortunately, any therapist he goes to probably isn't going to explore that potential.
No.
And
I think that's a factor, definitely. And that's why, as much as I loathe the sort of full-on activists who are clearly autogynephiles with a horrendous attitude towards women, there are, even within that community, there are young men who've been sucked into it who are victims, even though victims can also become perpetrators.
Right. So, and it's that, and that is again, it's one of the things that I notice among certain um, of those who are gender critical is a complete lack of empathy for the AGPs. And I get it, because sometimes I'm in that mindset, but I also have talked to enough AGPs, former AGPs, men who look like AGPs but aren't, to understand that this is much more complicated than just a creepy man who's got a sexual fetish. There's a whole lot more going on in a lot of cases. And certainly there are those who are just perpetrators and taking advantage of things, and really probably are better off behind bars to keep women safe. But there's a lot more going on with a lot of the other
There
men.
are I have sympathy for ones who are addressing it,
Mhm.
trying therapy, trying not to give into it,
Yeah.
and not involving women in there. But I have had my fingers burnt by a prominent out public autogynephile in the UK who's very well known, and was allowed in a group that was had all except him were women.
Yeah.
And very soon the creeping behavior, the testing of boundaries, bringing, who knows how far it would have escalated had we not all privately messaged the group saying, I'm feeling uncomfortable with this. And he was
Yeah.
ejected.
Good.
And
Well, and that's where I have a lot of respect for your son, that
Mm.
despite sort of taking on this identity, he's not actively undermining women's rights and protections by trying to, um, get into their spaces. That's where I feel there are a number of males, and I would call them transsexuals. That's what they were called when I was younger, who talk about feeling more comfortable presenting as women, but they don't try to get into women's spaces. They respect the biology, and they respect the differences, and they respect consent.
I
And
think one of another strand, now obviously I'm his mum, so I'm going to put a more positive construction on what he does. I do try and be critical, but you've always got to bear in mind you can never completely trust a mum. But he did talk to me once when he was a young boy. All his friends were girls, and one of them had clearly been the victim of. He said she was raped, mum, but she doesn't know she was raped. She doesn't realise. So basically, she'd gone somewhere with a boy, ended up with him having sex with her. She didn't want it, but she was told by all her girlfriends, you went up there, you knew what you were doing. And she internalized that feeling, and my son could see it clearly. So he did definitely. Another aspect of that is that some of the boys are rejecting male violence against women, and they don't want to be associated with it. And I know about the toilet thing, because we used to go to the pictures together. No boy wants to be seen going to the pictures with his mum. So afterwards, he'd normally go walk ahead, and I would usually have to visit the loo, as you do after you've had two children. And this particular time, I noticed that there was a man standing outside the women's toilets. There's no reason for him to be there. And I clocked it as soon as I went in. And I went into the toilets, but I was aware that this man had been standing outside. When I came out, my son was standing, arms folded, eyeballing the man, staring at him, and he'd waited. So he clearly understood that that man should not be there, and he was watching me to make sure that he didn't go in.
wow.
So he is, in that sense, he does get it on that level. Whether he has a fantasy that eventually he's going to be so passing he can blend in, I don't know. I'd like to think they will always honour that respect for women's boundaries, and I certainly will have made that clear to him that I expect him.
I think that's really awesome that you're doing that, because I think that that's something that many parents aren't willing to do, is set that really important boundary with their kids. Kids need to know that it's not okay for them to violate other people's spaces. And I think,
even in school, when he came out of school, they set up an LGBTQ club. Now I was already thinking that's going to be a bad idea. It's just going to make more of the time. But I didn't want to say no, because I thought maybe it's up to him, and maybe there'll be another gay boy, and that will be the thing. But he didn't want to go to that session, so he didn't. But we talked, and I just said, look, he's getting bullied in the male toilets. I'm more than happy for you to accommodate him somewhere else, but not in the girls' toilets. That's not appropriate. They're entitled to their own spaces when they're dealing with periods and just general teenage girl things where they don't want to be invaded. However lovely he is, he needs to have, and so I made that clear. And he was accommodated. Similarly with changing rooms, he wasn't forced. He wasn't even forced to play sport. He's not sporty at all. But his PE teacher just let him do exercise around the school playing field. So he didn't, even then, he's respected those boundaries. And now, obviously, I'm going back whether schools are more ideologically driven now. And I was very clear that was not happening. And they didn't dare. I don't think they dared undermine me. And maybe they were quite relieved not to have that dilemma.
Yeah, they might have been really thankful that you weren't a mom who was pushing to have everybody accept your son as a female, but just to recognize the bullying.
Yeah, so it was a perfect solution, really, in that it kept him safe but didn't compromise girls' spaces.
So you're speaking out about this. You're doing your blog. Where do you see things? Like, do you have a sense that things are starting to tip with Tavistock being closed and
yeah, I think the Tavistock thing is huge because we had a number of medical scandals here. One of them was Alder Hay, who were found to be retaining the organs of dead babies. Another one was I want to say Shrewsbury, it's not. It's a trust that was badly failing, and another one, Papworth, that had really bad outcomes for heart surgery. Not one of those hospitals had those services removed from them. The Tavistock has had it removed, so that's pretty huge. We've also got, obviously, we've got the Maya Fostata ruling. That's huge because it protects gender critical beliefs, and that's particularly important for women. I'm no longer in the workforce, but that's particularly important for women in the workforce. Today, we've had a Conservative MP, Suella Braverman, who's been very explicit. You can find that on YouTube, on Policy Exchange. I can send you the link. Sure. She's spoken up about the law does allow you to exclude males from female spaces, and it is proportionate to have, because if a woman will self-exclude because you're letting men in a female environment, then that is proportionate to exclude all males, whether they have a gender recognition certificate or not. That's pretty huge.
I want to make it clear that that's in the UK. In the US,
yeah, it is in the UK.
Yeah,
I know. So they're all positive signs here on Turf Island.
Well, which is good because you're a couple years ahead of us, I think. So potentially what's happening in the UK will come over to the US soon.
Yeah, well, hopefully. So there's still risks, because although Stonewall is looking at our main LGBT, which is mainly now a trans lobby group, they're coming under a lot more scrutiny and a lot more questioning, but there are loads of other emerging groups ready to step into their spaces. We've got a huge problem with the police, who seem to be acting as the armed wing of not armed, but the police wing of Stonewall. So there's lots of other things. The hate crime incidents is a very misused policy that is starting to come under a bit more scrutiny. I mean, we've got people acting on all sides. We've got gay men's networks now who are opposing that. We've got LGB Alliance. We've got Sex Matters, which is run by Maya Fostata. We've got writers like Helen Joyce, Kathleen Stock. I'm reading another book by Joanne Williams called The War on How the Woke Won, but it's a roadmap for how we start unpicking this from our institutions. That's very good. Yeah, we're starting to see the green shoots of recovery.
Thank goodness. Well, and I wonder if your son, once things sort of start to shift, if that might help him sort of have a sense of getting caught in this ideology, especially if he is sort of one of these kids that has this persona online, but not so much in person. Is there anything?
I was just going to say, by saying, actually, no, you can't use women's spaces, eventually, surely, that reason to be thinking that you're going to get invited to pillow fights and, all these stereotypical things that seem to be male fantasies projected on women that we never did, even as teenage girls, you know. But surely eventually it'll be, well, what are you doing it for? Because actually you can't use the female spaces, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. We should need to stop rewarding transgressive behaviours. And even if people don't think they're transgressive, we need to start signalling clear, this is transgressive behaviour. And society is not going to back down and bend over to your every demand. That's what needs to stop, because it's far too, we do need some legislation being repealed, I think, in the UK, and that's going to be a very hard fight, because once you've given someone a right, very difficult to ride back from that. But if we can strengthen the protection of sex, we can stop medicalising children, we can start looking at the long-term health impacts, and we start seeing, I mean, someone who I would regard as a friend, who's a post-operative transsexual and has been for many years, and has a very interesting backstory through their father that ended up, and they've had that identity for 20 years. They've recently re-identified as male. And in part, I think it's because, I mean, there's lots of complicated reasons for it, but I think the reason why we talked a lot was because they couldn't understand how their situation was being used to ride roughshod over all these different groups, and didn't feel comfortable with it. And I think that's the thing, the ones that are still remain rooted in reality and still have done this for whatever reasons, and you know, but now don't like what it's become. I think we're going to see more, and we're seeing more and more detransitioners, because you spoke to Richie, didn't you?
Yes, and his
Richie and
story
I
is
spoke
just
on the phone.
yeah.
Richie and I spoke on the phone, and I put him in touch with my other friend who has subsequently detransitioned, so they could speak.
Oh, good.
You need someone to talk to who understands what you've been through, don't you? But yeah, I think Richie's going to be on Graham Linehan today, and I'm hoping to speak to him again soon.
Yeah, and he's a strong voice, because he did not get appropriate care.
No, I mean, I sent Richie's YouTube things to my son.
Well, I really hope he watches them.
He'll start to see something. But yeah, I think, is there anything else you want to know from me?
Well, I was just wondering if there's anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about.
Just on my blog, there's a huge amount of research. There's things on BBC documentaries pushing this, transgender children being marketed, loads of blogs on the Tavistock, the Childline for people in the UK, because people still don't know, and are probably thinking Childline is a safe resource, and it absolutely is not. I've done a lot of things on the history of men in women's prisons, so we can start seeing how early and on what basis men are being allowed, even men who'd committed attempted rape in 2009.
We have
2009 that case was, and people didn't know. It's obviously been going on a lot longer than that, but that's a very key case, and that person committed attempted rape and then advised the House of Lords on transgender prisoners. So there's loads of stuff on there. It's all of it's linked.
And what's the name of it?
It's Gender Critical. I can send you the link, but it's Gender Critical Woman.
Yeah, and I know I've seen it, and I encourage everybody who's watching this to go look at it, because it is it's a wealth of information, and the fact that you sort of we're on the forefront of this, of documenting this. A lot of people have come on, you know, a little bit later, but you were there right at the beginning.
I mean, I was later than many, and Stephanie from Transgender Trend has got to be the trail.
Yeah.
So some of the content on my blog, as I've said to Stephanie, it's not that I don't think Stephanie's already done it, it's because I see my role as somehow an archivist. So some things I cover on there, even though I know they've been covered elsewhere, just so that people can have a one-stop shop to see the whole thing. And Stephanie Arai, she is the trailblazer, and so all credit to her.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe I'll put a link to her website as well. It's good to have lots of different perspectives, lots of different points of entry for people. And so I think that, you know, the more blogs we have, the more people who are pushing back on what is called research but really isn't, and pointing out all the flaws with both the justifications that they're using and the profound damage that this is doing.
We really have in the UK got now a tremendous community mutually promoting each other's work, sharing it, amplifying each other's causes, donating to financial causes. It has been a very concerted grassroots effort, despite the fact that we are told that we're somehow getting, oh, that's another thing that I cover on my blog as well, all of the money pushing it. A lot of it's coming from the States, but there's some charitable foundations in the UK involved. So I map all of the, if I find someone pushing this ideology, I will go and look and see if I can find where they're getting their funding from. And Arcus Foundation is one that crops up frequently.
And the UN is really pushing
I did a 10-part series on the United Nations as well.
Yeah,
because
and I
they've
found
got
that there's some lotteries in I believe it's Finland and Sweden, where funding from the state lotteries is actually being used to push this, which is crazy.
yeah,
It's just
the lottery funding is involved here as well. And then there's a fantastic Indian woman called Vashag Sundar. She did Dysphoria, the fantastic 4-parter. She tracked some money from foundations that was supposed to be for AIDS.
Right. Oh, yes, that's another AIDS. Yep, AIDS is another one. They're really getting in.
They're just taking the money and pushing it towards this.
Yeah, and it's all this, most of us, of course we want AIDS education. Well, when you look at what they're actually educating our children about, it's not how to prevent HIV.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your willingness to share your story, and I think that you're a really important model for parents trying to figure out how to navigate this, because I have parents ask me all the time, should I use their preferred pronouns? What boundaries should I put? And a lot of parents are afraid to say, no, you can't use women's spaces. I'm not going to use your pronouns. I'm going to use your given name. A lot of parents are really afraid to do that because they've been intimidated. And
my son has never asked me. He's never asked me, which I think is interesting, because he knows. So he's probably a little bit of an outlier. But the other thing that's on for parents who are scared about suicide is I've done some investigation with the help of a fantastic researcher, Michael Biggs. His work is fantastic. I cover his work a lot. I looked at suicide. So I think my son may have used it once, and I'm not going to lie, I would be frightened if he was in his room and he hadn't come down. I know what that feels like, that fear. And that you'd be to blame. I understand that completely. But taking a firm line hasn't saved my son from medicalising. But he's at home, we're still very close. We have managed to navigate this terrain with love.
And I want to just point out one thing that you said, that, if a child does actually complete suicide, that it is never the parent's fault. And that's a narrative that we hear so often. And so setting firm boundaries and expectations of children should never set a parent up for being blamed for the suicide of a child.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I said green sheets of recovery, just so people don't think I'm an idiot. I do know it's the green sheets of recovery.
The green.
I said green sheets of recovery. I meant to say green shoots of recovery. I do know what I was supposed to say. And that could have undermined the whole testament.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate your insights and all the work that you're doing to push back on this ideology.